There, friends, Dave Paulides, Canadian Missing Projects, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Before I forget, MontanaCon, October 8th, Kalispell, Montana. The QR code and the link to buy tickets for Sunday at the Red Lion Hotel in Kalispell. The speakers that are going to be there is going to be huge. The biggest speaker event I've ever been associated with. These guys are big. So, get your tickets now. And people always ask me, Dave, where do I buy your books? NA, like North America, nabigfootsearch.com. nabigfootsearch.com. Go to the store. All of our books, DVDs, everything are there. This is a letter segment. And we started off with Mike's letter number 1. And got a lot of good response. This is Mike's letter number 2. Away we go. Interestingly, my north property line is less than 3/4 of a mile from the south boundary of Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge, which includes Rice Lake, a 3,600-acre piece of water. The Rice River exits the lake. Also on the refuge are several small lakes. The entire area is filled with lakes and huge areas of wetland, approximately 25 miles south-southwest of Mille Lacs Lake. I've actually fished that lake before. And the Ojibwe Reservation. Very near my cabin are smaller to medium tracts of land housing the Sandy Lake Band of the Ojibwe. Then between me and Duluth, 40 miles south, is Fond du Lac Reservation, home to one of the 6 bands of the Minnesota Chippewa tribes. 60 miles west is Brainerd, where I spent 10 summers with Ben. Know the area well. 130 miles north is the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the Red Lake Band of the Chippewa. I've had many native acquaintances and conversations with them over the years up there. And so have I. And in fact, one of my books, I talk about going up there, meeting the tribal members, writing about it, sending Harvey Pratt up there to meet some tribal members as well. A statement by a native elder sticks out to me. He said calmly and matter of fact, this whole area up here is a moving portal. A moving portal. They are everywhere. I said, they as in Sasquatch or they are as in portals? He smiled and said yes, and then he left. His name was Marvin Rainwater. You may have heard of him. I like the way Marvin said that. A lot of people in the Bigfoot Sasquatch world cannot get their head wrapped around portals, multi-dimensions, and Bigfoot. Even though every major physicist in the world says they exist, they can't wrap their heads around it. I've always had a different feeling regarding Native Americans. I would get angry anytime anyone said something negative or just at the plight of the Native people in general. Amen, so do I. My best friend in the world, Native American Chief Harvey Pratt. Why in 2023 are these people still relegated to specific lands chosen by and controlled by the federal government? Why are they treated so differently than other minorities? Imagine if the whites tried to do that to the blacks now and the blacks want reparations. What about the natives? When I was active in the paranormal world, I met a man who was a PhD psychologist. He specialized in hypnotherapy and past life regression. I went through 2 regressions, and both times I experienced multiple lives. And in each, I was a Native American in the 17 and 1800s. Explains a lot for me. Yeah, that would, wouldn't it? I was an avid hunter since I was 8. I hunted bear, white-tailed deer, coyotes, birds, and waterfowl. Although I no longer hunt, I can still be found walking in the forest. I'm an independent, solitary person. As my friends have died or moved on, I don't replace them. I just don't have a lot in common with most people because of my background, my experiences, and their behaviors. I don't understand them. They don't get me. As part of a 6-man team, these 5 guys were my brothers, warriors who would die for each other. They cannot be replaced, and I won't try. Each has since died at their own hands. It was a traumatic life. I'm the last man standing. My wife and my son and my stepson are my best friends. I have always preferred to hunt alone, although back in the day I was part of a hunting group for many years, but still, I would go off on my own to hunt. I'm ultimately familiar with the black bear, white-tailed deer, moose, fisher, and gray wolf. I've had a strange experience with each. At one point I had a terrible physical altercation with a black bear sow and bog grasses over my head. I did call out, and as I walked, since there were bear out in the area and I couldn't see a thing, I blew my knee out, bruised ribs, bite marks, and scratched me. but I fought her off. I know all these animals' behaviors, vocalizations, habits, tracks, markings, odors, and travels. I have heard and seen each eat, pant, fight, cough, breed, call out, asleep, and die. My perfect day is wandering miles from my cabin, exploring the wilderness by myself. Foolish, perhaps, but I know my limitation, the risks, and how to survive out there if necessary. And I go prepared for a worst-case scenario. What if I get abducted? I'm ready. If I leave my property, I send my wife my intended travel routes, and a short time later I'll be back, getting a personal locator beacon very shortly. Thank you, Mike. You're too valuable to be lost. You need to have a PLB. Basically, of the land there is, an old logging trail goes south from adjacent to my place, 2.5 miles to the Rice River. The river is about 40 feet wide at the trail's end and 6 foot deep, depending on the annual beaver activity and rainfall. I always hunted across the river if I could cross it, which is difficult. No one else hunts over there. There's no access from other directions except in midwinter via snowmobile. It's a different world, a different uneasy feel over there. The kind that constantly has you looking over your shoulder and hair raised on your neck and arms, like the trees are watching you and whispering to each other as you travel. When GoPros came out, I bought one. When I'm in the wilderness, I have my phone or a digital camera near my hands. I wear the GoPro on my back. More times than I can count, whether on my ATV or on foot. When coming out, there are animal tracks in my tracks or crossing my trail. But even then, the weird feelings and experiences, something powerful draws me over there, as does Lake Superior. That lake, since I was a child, has had a very strong pull on me. I stare out over the lake for hours. Let me tell you something. Mike's smart. When I was spending a lot of time at the Hooper Reservation, they would send me, different tribal people would send me into areas and say, Dave, you need to go up here. Spiritual area, a lot of Bigfoot, blah, blah, blah. So one time I was going up this long, dusty road. There's this long hike. Spent the day, had lunch back there, slowly came back. As I'm coming back, I'm looking, it's an old logging road, dusty. Nobody had driven it in years, but dusty enough that you could see your tracks. In my tracks were large mountain lion tracks. And I thought, whoa, something is stalking me. It didn't surprise me. I had my gun, and you are not the alpha creature out there in the woods. I don't care what you think. You're not. And there's things out there that are probably in trees watching you that you just don't know. And mountain lions like to ambush from trees. On the way out, I saw this track pretty quick, and I kept looking in the trees and the bluffs ahead of me, because they'll lay in the bluff and come down on you. I get it, Mike. My property in the wilderness lands it adjoins have provided me with some of the most bizarre experiences of my life. Similarly, unexplained yet different than my childhood home, my son has had experiences at the cabins as well. In the mid to late 80s, something would happen that I had no explanation for except the closest explanation. In Minnesota, we bait bear. We don't use dogs. A bear was usually blamed as the event required the physicality of a bear, though it just didn't quite fit. For bear hunting, I would do what we call simple bait. Scout the area I want to hunt, fill a burlap sack with bait, attach a hefty rope, throw it over a horizontal tree limb 7 foot high or so to see if it would be able to reach and tear it open. Then I knew it was a large black bear to reach it. 1990, I believe, I was baiting and limbs were being demolished, and I felt uneasy about it. I felt it was beyond a black bear's ability. I found an 18-inch diameter healthy oak tree with a horizontal limb 9 feet up high and over a trail. I loaded the bag, hoisted it up, and left. The next day I returned. As I went down the trail, I couldn't believe my eyes. Not only was the bag torn to pieces, but the limb was broken off the tree, and the tree was broken off at the ground. The tree had zero rot, perfectly healthy. I said out loud, what the heck? But I quit when the op is completed, not when I'm hurt or tired or scared. When you have been so near death multiple times, you no longer fear it. If you don't fear death, well, there's nothing much else to fear. I hunted that specific location many times for deer and bear. Whatever it was at that time, it continued to dine on my offerings, and I never saw it. I also didn't see bear scat in that immediate area, and no bait was left behind. That was a red flag, and I couldn't pick up a trail. Yes, as you know, bears do shit in the woods, all over and near and where you eat, and where they eat. They leave scraps, and those scraps become maggot-covered in warm, humid weather, giving a direction of travel. Not to be outdone, I decided to change tactics. Instead of hunting typically in the afternoon and evening as I had been doing and seeing nothing, and the bait disappearing, I decided to hunt like deer season and go out at 4 a.m. and catch it coming off the bait. It's a good strategy. Do something a little different. It was late September. In Minnesota, the days were warm, leaves were mostly down, extremely dry. If a twig or acorn fell, you'd hear it in the leaves. Very near the bait site was a fortress of a stand we had built for years before for deer hunting. It was an old-growth virgin white tree oak, at least 4 foot in diameter. I got to the tree at 4 a.m. Several hundred-yard walk to it annoyed me because of the noise I made in the leaves. I'm trained how to walk in that environment, but it was not to be detected by man, not necessarily animals. I got into the tree and got settled. My pack leaned against the tree. My streamlight leaned against my pack. My rifle hung from a hook for that purpose. Off in the distance, I'd hear an occasional leaves crunch from a squirrel looking for acorns. Suddenly, loud, thudding, heavy, slow, crashing steps right near the tree. I could feel it. My thoughts spun. It's a human, bipedal, was all I could instantly think, wondering why I didn't hear them approaching as a long way off, as I lost that thought quickly because of a deep guttural growl panting sound. Then, like a bulldozer crashing into the tree, I was knocked off balance. My pack tipping over, flashlight tipping over, the tree shook. The panting continued. Hearing 4 more steps, I grabbed the streamlight. I lit up the area to see it was what it was. Nothing. It was silent. No panting, no leaves crunching, no eye shine, no odor, nothing. Because of the virgin timber, underbrush was minimal, and my light could see a long way. I looked 360 degrees for 20 minutes as it began to get light, and saw or heard nothing. This was not the panting of a bear that I'm familiar with. This was the end of bear hunting for that year for me. Oddly enough, being extremely well trained in tactical assaults, I didn't even think to grab my rifle or draw my handgun. That has bothered me still today. What if it had come up the tree? Beat it with my flashlight? It's like my ability to act defensively was on pause. It wasn't fear, because fear is one thing that triggers me into action. Now, how many times has that story been told to me? Or very similar? Too many to count, folks. And each time, it leads to, it was probably a Bigfoot. Specifically, Minnesota. That area has had a plethora of this type of activity. Do I believe Mike? 100%. And when I hear Bigfoot researchers say, oh, there's nothing paranormal or unusual associated with Bigfoot, I just laugh out loud at them now. I'm going to be doing 3 conferences before the end of the year with a group of people who think Bigfoot's an ape. And I'm going to get all kinds of harassment because of what I'll say. But I'm looking forward to it. Back to Mike. My wife was... okay. I was hearing the guttural panting right under the tree. I turned my light on as it stopped. The light came on. I was looking down around the tree. There was nothing there. Nothing retreating. No, I do not and never have slept in a stand while hunting anything. If I want to sleep, I'll stay comfortably in bed instead of out in the rain, snow, cold, mosquitoes, or heat. The very few people I told years later blew it off as I fell asleep and was dreaming. Not a chance. I can barely sleep when I'm in bed. I've seen several times a mature black bear climb a tree. Let me tell you, a mature black bear can climb a tree running up the tree, folks. Running up the tree. Any idea that you could climb a tree to get away from a bear is stupidity. Okay? A 400 to 500 pound bear can climb a 30-foot or higher tree in 2 seconds or less. It's unbelievable. 100%. So sleep in the stand when bear hunting or in bear country over bait. That dog don't hunt. My wife was from that area and her parents were about 6 miles away. Her dad was a heavy equipment operator when he was working, and was typically dredging Lake Superior shipping channels. When he wasn't working, he was contracted to grade non-paved county roads and minimum maintenance roads through desolate areas of the county. I asked him if he'd ever seen a mule deer around there because I had seen one. He says, as a matter of fact, he did many years ago. Then I asked him if he had ever seen anything unusual while grading. He was a Jehovah's Witness. Whether or not that entered into his reluctance to talk about it, he looked into my eyes briefly and kind of smiled and changed the subject like I hadn't asked the question. That's answering the question, though. The two side stories. One, my old buddy Bud, who would kind of hunt when he was there. He wasn't a serious hunter. He came up for deer hunting, and I put him in that tree. I'd found the honey hole of deer hunting spots for a year and a half, mile and a half away, and I would have been back in that stand. We were to meet at our ATVs 30 minutes past sunset. From where I was, I heard his ATV start and leave an hour before sunset. What the heck? There's a snowmobile trail a few hundred feet behind my stand. I heard wolves vocalizing. While they moved toward me uncharacteristically, they ran right at my tree. 5 of them. The last wolf dug its legs into the snow, skidding to a stop. It turned to face me, looking up, stood up on its hind legs, looked right at me, as if it did that all the time. It would seem like 15 seconds. Then it dropped back onto all fours and took off in the direction of the rest of the pack had run. Keep in mind, I remain motionless when hunting. Again, very well trained to not be seen or heard. No bragging, but my skill set and experience of tracking, scouting, and hunting for men and animals is tight still. I got back into the cabin, and Bud had a large glass of whiskey going. I asked, what the heck happened? You leave me out there all alone to die in the wilderness? He told me almost the same story I have just told you about the bear stand. I've never told a soul at that time what happened to me out there at the bear hunting. All I could do was shrug and shake my head. We never talked about it again. A couple years later, he had crawled into a whiskey bottle and never came out again. 2 almost identical incidents in the same tree, months apart. Number 2, when my son was a child, I built stands to hold both of us safely so we could see what hunting was like and if he wanted to do it. When my son was old enough to hunt with me, we hunted a few years together. Then he abruptly stopped. The problem was he would never tell me why. Once he told me it's the wolves. I asked if he had seen one, and he said no. I said, you know they want nothing to do with humans. And if one becomes aggressive, you're carrying a high-powered rifle. Do what you need to do, and we'll deal with it afterwards. Still, he wouldn't hunt. I'd used that velvet vice to question him, but he wouldn't talk about it, so I left it alone. He had his reasons. One day we were talking about Bud, who my son called Uncle. We had had talks about strange events by then, so I told him about my experience in that tree and also Bud's experience. My son looked like he was going to be sick. I asked if that story bothered him. He said, Dad, that's why I stopped hunting. The exact thing happened to me, only it wasn't a stand on this side of the river by the West Trail. He said he was so scared he wouldn't and couldn't talk about it for all these years. In the stand he was in, I was in one where I could just see glimpses of his orange blazer. I never wanted him too far away from me out there. I felt bad he didn't call for me. He was too scared and didn't want anything to happen to me because he knew I'd come running. Oddly, nothing unusual happened to me there, being that close to him. Now 3 identical incidents in the same general area. There's some people in the Bigfoot world that believe you get marked. And what does that mean? It's almost like you have an identifier placed on you. They know who you are. They know you're not going to bother them. And they want you to know that they're going to be around. Scott Carpenter was one of those guys that was marked. I guarantee it. And then, as many times we were together, we both agreed we were both marked. Sasquatches had come by Scott's house before. They'd come by my house in Colorado before and left huge tracks in the dirt out in front. I'd walk out the front door and you can't miss it. It's like, yeah, we've been here. You're okay. So I think Mike was marked. I think his son was marked. Maybe his family was marked. They knew of his cabin. They knew he wasn't going to hurt them. The year after that, I was with my hunting group. My best friend at the time, Bob, had bought 10 acres, which was 10 acres west of my 20. We were staying at his place bear hunting. 3 of us had permits. One night about 2 a.m., I woke to hear gunshots. Bob soon got up. We grabbed our long guns and headed down the road. We saw 2 guys bent over on the tree line. I figured they poached a deer and were either going to throw it into the van or get it out of there. There's a whole story there, but to be brief, yes, they poached a deer there, and I quickly scared them off. The rest of my group came to the end of the driveway hearing the shots, and we hung out there until morning. I knew 2 conservation enforcement officers in the area, and I went to see the oldest one. He asked, is the deer still there? I said, yes. Have you disturbed it? I said, no. Stay with it, and a forensic team will be there to look at it. Based on the location, it is almost likely related to a case we're working. We did that, and they arrived. They removed the skull cap, retrieved the bullet. They asked what we were doing there. Bear hunting. They asked if we wanted the carcass. Yes. That was unheard of, but they gave us a permit. The venison by that time was no longer edible for human consumption, but due to heat, I gave a description of the van, and later that day they found it, made 2 arrests on a sting. They were working for black market venison and poaching. Good. I hate poachers. Hate them. We took the deer out near the river to a spot off the trail and a couple 100 yards into the woods. Bob was an old-time pioneer kind of guy. I always told him he was born 200 years too late. He bought a spool of baling wire along. There were 3 of us. There were 8 of us. We held the carcass vertical against a tree. My friend wound the wire around the tree and spiraled it. He was a big man. It was a wrap twice around the tree in spirals. We wanted a bear to have to eat the deer there on the tree and stay nearby. No one else at that time hunted these woods. This was way off the trail. That deer was tight to the tree, and you couldn't get your fingers between the deer and the wire spiral. Next day I get out there to hunt. No deer. Gone. The wire was in pieces around the tree. No cut marks. It was literally broken into pieces. There were no tracks. Wire pieces were tightly bent into themselves. I couldn't straighten the bends again. What the heck? I stood and looked around. This was on a ridge. My gut was telling me a bear could not just break this wire many times with sheer force with no thumbs. But what else could do it? I figured it was a bear. It would have dragged it farther into the woods and not back towards the trail. But there were no drag marks anywhere. Red flag. I couldn't pick up a trail. I slowly switched back down the ridge. There is a stream that goes into the river. I sat on the ridge side and surveyed the area while thinking. Then I saw something unusual. I walked over, and there are 4 hooves sticking out of the ground about 10 inches to the second left leg joint. I thought, the SOB buried the deer. Then it hit me. Except for the hooves sticking out of the ground, there's no evidence of digging. Animals digging throw leaves and soil everywhere. This was a large, deep hole, and there was none of that. Red flag. I just happened to see the hooves. Had it been typical of an animal digging in a hole for the size of a deer, I would have seen that a long way off. Black dirt piled on dry, colorful leaves, very obvious. Where's the dirt that was removed? I looked all over. Red flag. I went back, got the crew. We exhumed the deer. I could see the wire indentations, but no evidence of predation or anything that wasn't already there. We left the blame on the bear, but not one of us was confident with that. We left the carcass for nature or whatever and didn't talk about it again. So let's talk about that for a second. I think that's pretty weird. I'm sorry. So some animals will cache their kill. Bears cache their kill. Mountain lions cache their kill, meaning bury it for later. But that doesn't make any sense, what he just explained. The back quarter of my property is a beaver pond. I don't like it. It's beautiful, great for wildlife, but my timber is disappearing and the water gets closer and closer. If I wanted lakeshore, I would have bought some. In the early 90s, Bud and my son were up there with me. We walked out onto the dam and decided to tear into it to drain or at least lower the pond and perhaps drive the beavers to another area. I knew it'd be a battle and that we would rebuild and we would tear it out and it'd go that way many times. But if we would make a big enough dent each day, we might win. We had a huge waterfall going and it was self-eroding by the end of the day. Day 2, we walk out of there. The dam was repaired, but there was a line of what I would describe as spears sticking out of the dam about 2 to 3 feet high, from one side of the dam to the other, about 9 feet, like a short picket fence. The points were sharpened, yet no wood chips in sight, like they were made with an axe somewhere else. We had to credit the beavers. Except how did they pound them into the wood dam and not impale their tails or feet? The 3 of us together could not pull them out with tools. Trying to dig limbs out of the dam was almost impossible. So how could a beaver get them in so tightly? Something with intelligence was saying, keep out. Those spears were less than 100 feet from my back property line. Years later, my son and his friends were up there out at the river modifying a dam to cross with ATVs. They crossed, and hours later they were returned, the same thing, spears sticking out of the cross dam. When I lived in Colorado, there was an area where we could go up and watch beavers. I'm not kidding about this. I told Angie years ago, if I had to go back and do it over again, I'd like to do a master's paper thesis on beavers and their engineering ability and how they can construct things the way they do. It's unbelievable. I've seen some of the things they've done. Unbelievable. How they can move trees that they down. Unbelievable. And the strength of what they build. I'm sure our engineers could learn something from them. I'm just saying. We used to sit there and watch them for hours. It was fascinating. One of the last times Bud was up there deer hunting with my son, and I was in the late 90s. We had come back to camp. He started some coals in the grill for steaks out on the deck, and I was inside preparing meal sides with my son. It was dark out. Bud bursts in looking like he's seen a ghost and says, something is going on out there. You better get out there. He's a Vietnam combat vet like me. Nothing rattles him. So to see his demeanor like this was concerning. As we walk out, it hits me in the face. A huge yellow ball pulsing at the distant tree line near the horizon. As best as I can estimate, 4 miles out. We just stared. It pulsated. Went straight up, slightly, then back down several times. No sound. This lasted 10 minutes or so. Then it slowly turned orange, red, and lowered into the tree line, hovering, pulsing. We could see it stationary in the trees, and then it just disappeared. Later that night, with the radio on, tuned to the only station we received from town 20 miles away, they reported people were calling into the station and the sheriff's office about lights in the sky. When I got home a few days later, I called the station, the sheriff's department, local newspaper from that town. No one acknowledged the sightings. I asked the radio station if I could speak to the announcer who worked the night about it. I received a hard no, and they hung up. That's all that was said that night. One time on the radio. In my cabin now, I built my back picture window to look out in that direction. I'll position my recliner to look out the window and watch until I fall asleep. In the last few years, I see that same thing from time to time at night. Where it is in the middle of nowhere. All water and bog, inaccessible in midwinter via snowmobile. My distance estimation is because I know where the tree line is in this area, and the thing hovers over. I've Google Earthed it, and there's nothing there but water, wetland, and desolation. Okay, starters. For you people that have followed me a long time, and you've read The Hoopa Project and Tribal Bigfoot, I've made a huge association between Bigfoot and water. Huge. It's important. And orbs and water. And orbs and Bigfoot. If you haven't watched this movie, please go to Amazon right now and watch it. Missing 411, The UFO Connection. And why is that important? Orbs and UFOs. Missing people. In the area that Mike talks about, in this northern Minnesota region, been a lot of disappearances. Some of the strangest disappearances I've ever worked in my life. And you cannot ignore the association that we made in that movie, Missing 411, The UFO Connection. That association is something that we can't ignore. Huck agrees. So friends, that was part 2 of Mike's letter. I appreciate you being here. Mike, I appreciate you writing to me. And part 3, I'll post that in the near future. Please share this on your social media. I would be very, very grateful if you did. And thank you for everyone out there who has sent in a letter that is as well written and thought out as Mike's. Thank you. Paulides out.